The metallic glint of a silver coin spinning through the scorching Arizona air caught the sunlight for one impossible moment before the sharp crack of a rifle echoed across Fort Thunderbolt's firing range, and Colonel Harrison Steele watched in stunned silence as his lucky coin, the one he'd carried through 3 wars, exploded into fragments mid-flight, leaving nothing but metallic dust drifting in the desert wind and the smoking barrel of a rifle held by a woman he'd refused to let touch a weapon just minutes before. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But that moment of reckoning was still hours away and private. Elena Vasquez had no idea that her entire military career was about to change with a single impossible shot. The morning sun blazed mercilessly over Fort Thunderbolt's Advanced Marksmanship Training Center, transforming the concrete buildings into furnaces and sending heat waves shimmering across the shooting ranges that stretched toward the distant Copper Canyon Mountains. Elena pushed her supply cart along the dusty path between the training facilities, her boots kicking up small clouds of red Arizona dirt with each step. For 8 months, she'd been assigned to the ammunition supply division, counting bullets and cleaning rifles while watching the elite sharpshooter candidates train just 50 yards away. Elena's official designation was support personnel, which everyone at Fort Thunderbolt understood to mean she was there to serve coffee, distribute equipment, and stay invisible while the real soldiers did the important work. The Advanced Marksmanship program was the most prestigious training course in the Southwest, producing the military's finest precision shooters for deployment to special operations units worldwide. 24 candidates had been selected from thousands of applicants, all men, all with exceptional service records and proven combat experience. And then there was Elena Vasquez, age 23, daughter of an auto mechanic from Riverside Valley, California, whose only qualification seemed to be her ability to organize ammunition supplies with military precision. Master Gunnery Sergeant Dale Grimmer had made the hierarchy crystal clear on Elena's first day at the facility. Grimmer was a walking legend, 6 foot 4 inches of solid muscle, with arms covered in tattoos commemorating his 14 years as a Marine Corps sniper. His confirmed elimination count from tours in Afghanistan and Somalia was classified, but the whispered rumors put it somewhere north of 100. When Grimmer spoke, everyone from privates to lieutenants listened with religious attention. "Vasquez," he'd said that first morning, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "Your job is simple. Count the ammunition, clean the weapons when we're done with them, and keep your mouth shut while professionals handle the real work. Think you can manage that without screwing something up?" Elena had nodded silently, swallowing the words that wanted to escape. She'd learned early in her military service that reactions only provided ammunition for further attacks, so she'd perfected the art of staying invisible while observing everything. What none of them knew was that Elena Vasquez had been handling firearms since before she could properly spell her own name. What they didn't know was that her father, Ricardo Vasquez, had spent 4 years as a competitive marksman before a factory accident ended his shooting career and forced him into automotive repair to support his family. What they definitely didn't know was that Ricardo had spent every weekend of Elena's childhood teaching her to shoot with the patience and precision of someone who understood that marksmanship wasn't just about pulling triggers, it was about mathematics, physics, breathing control, and mental discipline that bordered on meditation. "Mia," her father would say during their weekend trips to the abandoned quarry outside Riverside Valley, "shooting isn't about the gun. The gun just does what your mind tells it to do. First you master your mind, then you master everything else." By age 16, Elena could consistently hit targets at 800 yards with her father's aging hunting rifle. By 18, she could calculate wind speed, bullet drop, and atmospheric pressure adjustments faster than most people could work out restaurant tips. By 20, she'd quietly broken several unofficial shooting records at local competitions while working her way through community college on academic scholarships. But Elena had learned something else during those formative years. Being exceptional at something didn't matter if people refused to believe you were capable of excellence. Her high school guidance counselor had steered her away from engineering programs despite her perfect math scores. College professors had questioned her presence in advanced physics courses. And when she'd finally enlisted in the Army, seeking a chance to use her skills in service of something greater than herself, she'd been assigned to logistics and supply chains rather than any combat-related specialty. Women can serve, the recruiting sergeant had explained with condescending patience, but certain roles require physical and mental characteristics that are better suited to male soldiers. Nothing personal, just biology. Elena had accepted the assignment without protest, knowing that arguing would only confirm their preconceptions about emotional female recruits who couldn't handle military reality. But she'd also made a quiet promise to herself. She would find a way to prove that their assumptions were not just wrong, but catastrophically mistaken. The advanced marksmanship program at Fort Thunderbolt represented the culmination of everything she'd been working toward. The finest precision shooting instruction in the military, taught by legendary experts, using equipment that most civilian marksmen could only dream of accessing. Elena had requested transfer to the program 17 times in her first year of service. Each application returned with polite form letters, explaining that she lacked the prerequisite qualifications for consideration. So she'd taken the only path available, assignment to the support staff that kept the program running. If they wouldn't let her participate as a student, she'd find another way to access the training, the instructors, and most importantly, the weapons that could finally demonstrate what she was capable of achieving. Every morning, Elena watched Sergeant Grimmer's students practice their fundamentals. She memorized their shooting positions, studied their breathing techniques, and noted their common mistakes. She observed how the instructors corrected stance problems, explained ballistics calculations, and guided students through the mental disciplines required for precision shooting under pressure. And every evening, alone in the supply building, Elena practiced those same techniques with unloaded rifles, perfecting her form and rehearsing the muscle memory that would be essential when her moment finally arrived. Because Elena Vasquez knew something that everyone at Fort Thunderbolt would soon discover: talent doesn't recognize gender. Skill doesn't depend on expectations, and sometimes the most dangerous person on a firing range is the one everyone assumes doesn't belong there. The only question was whether she'd get the chance to prove it before her transfer orders came through, sending her to another support role at another base where her abilities would remain forever hidden. But fate, as Elena would soon learn, sometimes provides opportunities in the most unexpected moments. And today would bring a chance that would change not only her own future, but the entire culture of precision shooting in the United States military. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Master Gunnery Sergeant Dale Grimmer ruled Fort Thunderbolt's advanced marksmanship program like a feudal lord commanding his territory. And he had spent the better part of 2 decades perfecting the art of breaking soldiers who didn't measure up to his impossibly high standards. His domain stretched across 15 acres of precision shooting ranges, climate-controlled weapons storage facilities, and tactical training courses that had produced some of the military's most lethal marksmen. Grimmer's office walls told the story of a career built on excellence and uncompromising standards. Framed certificates documented his graduation from every elite sniper school in the military arsenal: Marine Corps Scout Sniper School, Army Special Operations Target Interdiction course, and the legendary Advanced Urban Precision Shooting Program that accepted fewer than 20 students annually. His Purple Heart and Bronze Star medals shared space with photographs of him alongside generals and special operations, commanders whose names never appeared in public records. But the centerpiece of Grimmer's collection was a custom-built display case containing his service rifle from Somalia, a weapon that had earned him the unofficial title of Ghost of Mogadishu after a series of precision eliminations that had turned the tide of several critical missions. The rifle represented everything Grimmer believed about his profession, that marksmanship was a sacred art requiring years of dedicated training, unwavering mental discipline, and most importantly, the right kind of warrior mindset that couldn't be taught to just anyone. Precision shooting, Grimmer would lecture his students during morning briefings, isn't about squeezing triggers and hoping for the best. It's about becoming a human weapon system capable of delivering lethal force at distances where lesser soldiers can't even see their targets. This program produces apex predators, not weekend hunters. Grimmer's teaching philosophy was built on a foundation of systematic pressure designed to identify weakness before it could compromise mission effectiveness. He'd perfected techniques for pushing students beyond their comfort zones, forcing them to perform under conditions that simulated the stress and chaos of actual combat. Students who couldn't handle his methods were dismissed without ceremony, their failures serving as examples to motivate the survivors. Elena had observed these dismissals during her months at Fort Thunderbolt, watching as confident soldiers were reduced to doubt and self-recrimination under Grimmer's relentless scrutiny. He had an uncanny ability to identify each student's psychological vulnerabilities, then exploit those weaknesses with surgical precision until they either adapted or broke completely. Private Jake Morrison, a former college football player from Texas, had been eliminated after Grimmer repeatedly questioned his shooting fundamentals in front of the entire class, suggesting that his previous success had been lucky accidents rather than genuine skill. Corporal Anthony Rivers, who'd arrived with exceptional test scores from basic training, found himself dismissed after Grimmer convinced him that his methodical approach to shooting was too slow for real-world applications. But Grimmer reserved his most creative psychological warfare for anyone who challenged his authority or questioned his methods. Lieutenant Bobby Chun had made the mistake of suggesting an alternative breathing technique he'd learned from a civilian competition shooter, only to find himself assigned to equipment maintenance duties until he developed sufficient respect for military instruction protocols. Elena had watched these destructions from her position in the supply building, noting how Grimmer's influence extended far beyond his immediate students. The entire facility operated according to his preferences, his schedule, and his vision of what constituted proper military bearing. Even Colonel Harrison Steele, the base commander and Grimmer's nominal superior, seemed to defer to the sergeant's expertise in matters related to marksmanship training. Grimmer knows more about precision shooting than anyone else in the Southwest. Colonel Steele had explained to visiting brass from the Pentagon, "I give him complete authority over program operations because he delivers results that speak for themselves." Those results were indeed impressive. Grimmer's graduates consistently achieved the highest scores in advanced shooting competitions, earned selection for the most elite special operations units, and returned from deployments with mission success rates that exceeded every statistical benchmark. The advanced marksmanship program at Fort Thunderbolt had become a model that other bases attempted to replicate. Though none achieved comparable success rates, Grimmer understood that his reputation depended on maintaining absolute standards, which meant ensuring that only the right kind of soldiers gained access to his training. The selection process was deliberately designed to eliminate candidates who might reflect poorly on the program's reputation, particularly those who lacked the physical attributes, mental toughness, or background experience that Grimmer considered essential for success. Women, in Grimmer's carefully considered opinion, represented an unnecessary risk to program integrity. Not because they couldn't learn to shoot accurately, he'd acknowledge their potential for basic marksmanship, but because their presence introduced complications that compromised the warrior culture he'd spent years developing. Combat operations required soldiers who could function as seamless teams under extreme stress, and introducing gender dynamics into that equation created variables that no amount of training could adequately address. This isn't about fairness or equal opportunity, Grimmer would explain to officers who questioned his all-male classes. This is about producing the most effective fighting force possible. When lives depend on split-second decisions and perfect execution, you don't experiment with social engineering. Elena had overheard these conversations during her supply duties, understanding that Grimmer's position wasn't based on personal animosity, but on philosophical convictions about military effectiveness. He genuinely believed that maintaining traditional standards served the greater good, protecting both his students and the missions they would eventually support. But Elena had also observed something else during her months at Fort Thunderbolt. Grimmer's students, despite their exceptional individual skills, sometimes struggled with adaptability when faced with unexpected situations. Their training had been so focused on perfecting specific techniques that they occasionally froze when circumstances demanded creative solutions or unconventional approaches. During a recent field exercise, she'd watched through binoculars as two of Grimmer's top students failed to identify an alternative shooting position when their primary location was compromised by changing wind conditions. They'd continued attempting shots from a position that was clearly inadequate rather than relocating to higher ground that would have provided better angles and stability. Elena had immediately recognized the superior position, a rocky outcropping that offered natural concealment and eliminated the wind factor that was causing their misses. But she was just supply personnel, invisible to the instructors and students who were focused on executing their prescribed training protocols. That observation had crystallized something important for Elena. Excellence wasn't just about following established procedures, but about adapting those procedures to achieve optimal results under varying conditions. Grimmer's system produced highly skilled technicians, but Elena suspected that true mastery required something more flexible, more intuitive, more willing to improvise when circumstances demanded innovation. The question was whether she'd ever get the opportunity to demonstrate that her approach might offer advantages that Grimmer's traditional methods couldn't achieve. Because Elena was beginning to understand that proving her competence would require more than just accurate shooting. It would require showing that her perspective could enhance the program's effectiveness in ways that Grimmer had never considered. And that realization would soon lead to a confrontation that would test everything both of them believed about marksmanship, military tradition, and the true nature of warrior excellence. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered through military postal channels but bearing no return address or official markings. Elena discovered it slipped under her barracks door when she returned from her pre-dawn supply inventory duties. The cream-colored envelope, standing out against the institutional gray flooring like a secret waiting to be revealed. Inside, written in her father's careful handwriting, were words that would change everything she thought she knew about her family's history. "Mia," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then you've found your way to a shooting program somewhere, just like I always knew you would. Your mother thinks I should have told you this years ago, but I wanted you to discover your own path first, without the weight of expectations or the burden of living up to someone else's legacy." Elena sat on her narrow bunk, the letter trembling slightly in her hands as she continued reading. Outside her window, she could hear the distant sounds of morning training exercises beginning on the ranges, but her entire attention was focused on her father's revelation. "The truth is, Elena, that your grandfather, my father, wasn't just some weekend marksman who taught me to shoot beer cans in the desert. Staff Sergeant Miguel Vasquez served as a designated marksman with the 101st Airborne during the Vietnam War, and his service record includes details that were classified for nearly 40 years. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Her grandfather had died when she was 7 years old, and she remembered him only as a quiet man who spoke softly and always seemed to be listening for sounds that no one else could hear. Her father had rarely discussed his father's military service, saying only that Miguel had served his country with honor and preferred not to talk about the war. Miguel accumulated 127 confirmed eliminations during his 2 tours in Southeast Asia. The letter continued, but more importantly, he developed shooting techniques that were decades ahead of their time. The military classified his methods because they gave American forces significant tactical advantages that they didn't want enemy forces to understand or replicate. Elena set the letter down for a moment, trying to process the magnitude of what she was learning. Her grandfather hadn't just been a soldier, he'd been an innovator whose techniques had influenced military doctrine. And somehow that knowledge had been passed down through her father's weekend training sessions at the abandoned quarry. After Miguel returned from Vietnam, he spent years adapting his military techniques for civilian applications. He taught me everything he'd learned about advanced marksmanship, but he made me promise never to reveal the source of that knowledge unless I encountered someone who truly needed it. Someone who was fighting battles that conventional training couldn't prepare them for. Elena picked up the letter again, her hands steadier now as understanding began to dawn. The shooting techniques I taught you, Mia, weren't just good advice from an old automotive mechanic. They were combat-proven methods developed by one of the finest marksmen in American military history. Your grandfather's breathing control techniques reduce heart rate variability by 30% compared to standard military instruction. His positioning methods account for micro-movements that most shooters never even recognize. His mental preparation protocols were studied by sports psychologists and adopted by Olympic shooting teams. The letter included detailed diagrams that Elena had never seen before, technical drawings showing advanced shooting positions, wind calculation formulas that went far beyond anything taught in basic marksmanship courses, and breathing exercises designed to maintain accuracy under extreme stress. These weren't the simplified techniques her father had taught her during their weekend sessions. These were the complete, unfiltered methods that had made her grandfather legendary among his peers. But Miguel's greatest innovation, the letter explained, was his approach to adaptive marksmanship. While other marksmen focused on perfecting specific techniques, he developed systems for rapidly adjusting to changing conditions. He could calculate wind variations, atmospheric pressure changes, and target movement patterns faster than most people could work out basic arithmetic. More importantly, he could teach others to do the same. Elena realized that this explained something she'd always wondered about: why her father's training had emphasized flexibility and improvisation rather than rigid adherence to specific procedures. While other shooters she'd observed focused on replicating identical techniques, she'd been taught to constantly adjust her approach based on environmental factors, weapon characteristics, and situational demands. The reason I'm telling you this now, her father's letter continued, is that your mother and I have been following your military career, and we know you're facing challenges that conventional training can't prepare you for. The techniques Miguel developed weren't just about shooting accurately. They were about proving that excellence comes from understanding principles, not just following procedures. Attached to the letter were photocopied pages from her grandfather's original training manual, a document that had never been officially published but had been quietly circulated among elite military instructors for decades. The manual contained advanced techniques for shooting in extreme weather conditions, methods for maintaining accuracy during extended operations, and psychological protocols for performing under life or death pressure. Elena spent the next hour studying the manual, recognizing elements that her father had incorporated into her training, but understanding now that she'd received only a simplified version of far more sophisticated techniques. The complete system was designed not just for exceptional accuracy, but for adaptability under conditions that would cause other marksmen to fail completely. Your grandfather always said that the mark of a true marksman isn't hitting targets under perfect conditions. The letter concluded. It's hitting impossible targets when everything goes wrong, when the wind is shifting, when the pressure is overwhelming, and when failure isn't an option. He believed that kind of shooting couldn't be taught through repetition alone. It required understanding the science behind every variable and developing intuition that could adapt faster than conscious thought. The final page of the letter contained a personal note that made Elena's eyes water. Mia, your grandfather saw something special in you during those few years before he passed away. He told me once that you had the eyes of a natural marksman, not because of your vision, but because of the way you observed everything around you, always calculating angles and distances even when you weren't holding a rifle. He said you would someday face people who would try to convince you that you didn't belong, that you weren't capable of excellence, that your gender or background or unconventional path made you inferior to those who followed traditional routes. Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, remembering suddenly how her grandfather used to watch her during family gatherings, smiling quietly when she would estimate distances to various objects or unconsciously calculate the trajectory needed to throw a ball to specific targets. But Miguel also said that when that moment came, when you were finally given the opportunity to prove yourself, you would demonstrate capabilities that would surprise everyone, including yourself. The techniques he developed weren't just about shooting, Elena. They were about showing that innovation and adaptability could exceed traditional methods, that understanding principles could triumph over rigid procedures, and that true excellence belonged to those who were willing to think differently. The letter ended with specific instructions for accessing additional training materials that her grandfather had left in her father's care, including advanced ballistics calculations, environmental adaptation techniques, and mental preparation. Protocols that had never been formally documented. Elena folded the letter carefully and placed it in her footlocker alongside the training manual pages. Outside her window, she could hear Sergeant Grimmer's voice carrying across the ranges as he began the morning instruction session, his words sharp and authoritative as he guided his students through their prescribed exercises. But Elena now understood something that would change everything. She wasn't just a supply clerk with weekend shooting experience. She was the inheritor of a legacy that predated Grimmer's methods, that had been combat tested under conditions he'd never faced, and that offered approaches to marksmanship that his traditional training couldn't match. The question was no longer whether she belonged at Fort Thunderbolt's advanced marksmanship program. The question was whether she would get the opportunity to demonstrate that her grandfather's innovations could revolutionize how the military understood precision shooting itself. The opportunity came 3 weeks later during what should have been a routine equipment inspection. But fate has a way of creating pivotal moments from the most mundane circumstances. Elena was conducting her weekly inventory of rifle cleaning supplies when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Private Danny Rodriguez, one of Grimmer's newest students, had been assigned to weapon maintenance duty as punishment for what the sergeant considered inadequate focus during breathing exercises. Rodriguez was methodically disassembling rifles for deep cleaning, but Elena could see immediately that he was making a critical error that would render several weapons dangerously unreliable. The gas rings in 4 different rifles had been installed backwards, a mistake that would cause catastrophic pressure buildup during firing. Any soldier attempting to use those weapons would face potential bolt failure, which could result in metal fragments being driven into their face and eyes. Rodriguez was young, eager to complete his punishment duty quickly, and completely unaware that his hurried work was creating death traps disguised as functioning rifles. Elena faced an impossible choice. Military protocol demanded that she report the error through proper channels, which meant informing Sergeant Grimmer, who would then descend on Rodriguez with the kind of brutal criticism that had already reduced 2 other students to nervous wrecks. Rodriguez would likely be dismissed from the program, his military career permanently damaged by a mistake born of inexperience rather than incompetence. But Alina also knew that those rifles were scheduled for use in tomorrow's advanced shooting exercise where students would be firing high-pressure rounds at maximum ranges. If Rodriguez's error went undetected, someone could be seriously injured or killed. Alina made a decision that would change everything. She approached Rodriguez quietly, speaking in the respectful tone she'd perfected during her months of invisibility. "Private Rodriguez," she said carefully, "I think there might be an issue with those gas ring installations." Rodriguez looked up from his work, confusion evident on his young face. "Ma'am?" "I followed the manual exactly." Alina knelt beside him, pointing to the rifle he'd just reassembled. "The rings are backwards. See how the beveled edge is facing the wrong direction? That's going to cause pressure buildup that could blow the bolt back into the shooter's face." Rodriguez stared at the weapon, then back at Alina. "Are you sure? I mean, no offense, ma'am, but you're supply personnel. How would you know about rifle mechanics?" It was a fair question, and Alina realized she was about to reveal knowledge that would inevitably raise other questions. But she couldn't watch Rodriguez unknowingly create weapons that might kill his fellow students. "My father was a gunsmith," she lied smoothly. "I grew up working on rifles. Trust me on this, those gas rings will cause a catastrophic failure." Rodriguez hesitated, clearly torn between following Alina's advice and questioning whether a supply clerk could possibly understand military weapons better than he did. Alina could see the internal debate playing out on his face, and she knew she needed to provide more convincing evidence. "Here," she said, picking up one of the improperly assembled rifles. "Let me show you the difference." Alina began disassembling the weapon with fluid, practiced motions that spoke of years of experience. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, removing components in the exact sequence her grandfather's manual had specified for field maintenance. Under combat conditions, within 90 seconds, she'd completely broken down the rifle, identified the reversed gas rings, and begun reassembling it correctly. Rodriguez watched in amazement as Alina's fingers flew over the weapon's components, each movement deliberate and efficient. She wasn't consulting the manual or hesitating over procedures. She was working from muscle memory that clearly predated her assignment to Fort Thunderbolt. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said quietly, "where did you learn to do that?" Alina realized she'd made a tactical error. Her grandfather's techniques for rapid disassembly were designed for combat situations where speed was critical, and they involved shortcuts and efficiencies that weren't taught in standard military training. Rodriguez was staring at her with the expression of someone trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he thought he knew about supply personnel capabilities. "Like I said," Alina replied, not looking up from her work, "my father taught me about rifles." But Rodriguez wasn't convinced. "Ma'am, I've been through basic weapons training and 6 months of advanced marksmanship instruction, and I've never seen anyone break down a rifle that fast. That's like expert-level stuff." Alina finished reassembling the weapon and handed it back to Rodriguez, the gas rings now properly installed. "Sometimes civilian experience translates to military applications," she said diplomatically. "The important thing is that this rifle is safe to fire now." Rodriguez accepted the weapon, but didn't return to his work. Instead, he continued studying Alina with obvious curiosity. "Ma'am, can I ask you something? Why are you working supply if you know this much about weapons?" Alina had prepared for this question during her months at Fort Thunderbolt, understanding that eventually someone would notice discrepancies between her assigned role and her actual capabilities. Sometimes the Army assigns people based on available positions rather than optimal skill matching, she said. "I go where I'm needed." Rodriguez nodded, but Alina could see that her explanation hadn't fully satisfied his curiosity. He was young, enough to still believe that military assignments always reflected individual capabilities, and witnessing Elena's expertise had clearly challenged that assumption. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said hesitantly, "have you ever actually fired any of these?" "Rifles?" Elena paused, recognizing that she was approaching another decision point. Rodriguez's question was innocent enough, but her answer would determine whether this conversation remained a private exchange or became something that might eventually reach Sergeant Grimmer's attention. "I've had some shooting experience," she admitted carefully. Rodriguez's eyes lit up with excitement. "Would you mind if I asked what kind of experience?" Elena looked around the supply building, confirming that they were alone and that no one else could overhear their conversation. Rodriguez seemed genuinely curious rather than suspicious, and his earlier mistake with the gas rings suggested that he could benefit from guidance that went beyond standard military instruction. "My father taught me precision shooting techniques," Elena said finally. "Long-range accuracy, environmental compensation, that sort of thing." Rodriguez leaned forward eagerly. "Could you maybe show me some of those techniques? I mean, when you have time? Sergeant Grimmer is always telling us we need to improve our fundamentals, but sometimes his explanations are hard to follow." Elena understood exactly what Rodriguez meant. Grimmer's teaching style assumed that students already possessed foundational knowledge that many of them had never actually acquired. He would demonstrate advanced techniques without explaining the underlying principles, leaving students to figure out the connecting logic through trial and error. "I could share some basic principles," Elena said carefully. "But you understand that any training you receive should complement, not replace your official instruction." Rodriguez nodded enthusiastically. "Of course, ma'am. I just want to understand the fundamentals better so I can keep up with the other students." Elena made another decision that would prove pivotal. "All right. When you finish with the rifles, meet me at the supply building's rear entrance. I'll show you some breathing and positioning techniques that might help." 20 minutes later, Elena found herself providing impromptu marksmanship instruction, using an unloaded training rifle and her grandfather's advanced techniques. She demonstrated breathing patterns that synchronized with natural heart rhythm, positioning adjustments that accounted for individual body mechanics, and sight alignment methods that compensated for minor vision variations. Rodriguez absorbed the instruction with remarkable focus, asking intelligent questions and implementing corrections with impressive speed. Elena realized that he wasn't struggling because he lacked talent. He was struggling because Grimmer's teaching methods didn't match his learning style. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said after practicing the breathing techniques for several minutes, "this is completely different from what Sergeant Grimmer teaches. Your way feels more natural." Elena nodded. "Different instructors emphasize different aspects of marksmanship. The goal is finding techniques that work best for your individual characteristics." Rodriguez attempted the breathing pattern again, and Elena could see immediate improvement in his stability and focus. Her grandfather's techniques were designed to work with natural physiological responses rather than fighting against them, which made them more intuitive for most shooters. "This is incredible," Rodriguez whispered. "I feel like I finally understand what breathing control is supposed to accomplish." Elena smiled, remembering her own excitement when her father had first explained these same principles. Understanding the why makes the how much easier to execute. Rodriguez practiced for another 10 minutes, then looked at Elena with obvious gratitude. "Ma'am, thank you for taking the time to help me. I know this isn't your job." Elena helped him secure the training rifle. Sometimes helping others is more important than job descriptions. As Rodriguez prepared to leave, he turned back with one final question. "Ma'am, I hope this isn't inappropriate, but have you ever considered applying for the advanced marksmanship program? I mean, you clearly know more about shooting than most of the students." Elena's smile was careful and diplomatic. "I serve where I'm assigned, Private Rodriguez. But I appreciate the suggestion." After Rodriguez left, Elena remained in the supply building, contemplating what had just occurred. She'd successfully demonstrated advanced techniques, solved a potentially dangerous problem, and provided effective instruction, all while maintaining her cover as supply personnel. But she'd also revealed capabilities that would inevitably generate questions if Rodriguez discussed their session with other students. Elena realized that she was no longer completely invisible at Fort Thunderbolt. Rodriguez would remember her expertise, might mention it to his classmates, and could potentially draw Sergeant Grimmer's attention to discrepancies between her assigned role and her actual knowledge. The question was whether that exposure would create opportunities or complications, because Elena was beginning to understand that hiding her abilities indefinitely was neither sustainable nor strategically advantageous. At some point, she would need to decide whether to continue playing the role of invisible supply clerk or risk everything by revealing who she really was. Word traveled faster than Elena had anticipated, and Sergeant Grimmer's response was swift, calculated, and devastating in its precision. It began with what appeared to be a routine adjustment to Elena's duties. The morning after her session with Rodriguez, Elena arrived at the supply building to find a new duty roster posted on her door. Instead of her usual ammunition inventory and equipment maintenance responsibilities, she'd been reassigned to comprehensive weapons inspection protocols that required her to examine every rifle in the facility for potential safety hazards and maintenance irregularities. On the surface, the assignment seemed like recognition of her mechanical expertise. But Elena quickly realized that Grimmer had crafted a perfect trap disguised as expanded responsibility. The weapons inspection protocol required Elena to document every minor imperfection she discovered: scratches on metal surfaces, slight variations in trigger pull weight, microscopic irregularities in barrel rifling that required specialized equipment to detect. More importantly, it required her to present her findings to Sergeant Grimmer personally during daily briefings, where he would review her work with the kind of meticulous attention usually reserved for military court proceedings. Vasquez, Grimmer announced during her first inspection briefing, his voice carrying across the facility with deliberate volume. "You've identified 17 separate maintenance issues across 48 weapons. That's an error rate of 35% in equipment that passed military quality standards just last month." Elena stood at attention, recognizing that Grimmer was establishing a narrative for the benefit of his students who were conducting morning exercises nearby. "Sergeant, those are minor cosmetic imperfections that don't affect weapon functionality. The rifles are mechanically sound." Grimmer picked up one of Elena's inspection reports, studying it with exaggerated scrutiny. "So you're telling me that a small scratch on the stock isn't worth documenting? That slight variations in trigger mechanisms don't merit attention? Are you suggesting that attention to detail isn't important in precision shooting?" Elena felt the trap closing around her. If she agreed that minor imperfections were significant, she'd be admitting that her previous equipment maintenance had been inadequate. If she argued that the issues were cosmetic, she'd be contradicting military standards that emphasize perfection in all aspects of weapon maintenance. "Sergeant, I was following the inspection checklist provided to me," Elena replied carefully. Grimmer nodded slowly, as if her response confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Yes, you were following procedures. But effective military personnel don't just follow checklists, Vasquez. They understand the purpose behind those procedures and apply judgment that serves mission effectiveness." Elena realized that Grimmer had maneuvered her into a position where any response would be wrong. He was using her technical competence against her, suggesting that someone with her level of mechanical knowledge should have exercised better judgment about what constituted genuine problems versus routine maintenance items. The psychological pressure escalated over the following weeks. Grimmer began scheduling Elena's inspection briefings during times when his students were transitioning between exercises. ensuring that maximum numbers of personnel would witness her being systematically criticized for work that met or exceeded standard military requirements. Vasquez identified a gas ring installation that required adjustment. Grimmer announced during one particularly public briefing, referring to her correction of Rodriguez's error. But rather than following proper reporting procedures, she chose to provide unauthorized instruction to military personnel. Can anyone explain why that represents a breakdown in command structure? Several students raised their hands, eager to demonstrate their understanding of military hierarchy. Elena was forced to stand silently while they explained why supply personnel shouldn't provide technical guidance to combat-trained soldiers, why unauthorized instruction could compromise official training protocols, and why maintaining clear boundaries between support staff and operational personnel was essential for mission effectiveness. Elena understood that Grimmer was systematically destroying any credibility she might have gained from her technical demonstrations. By framing her competence as insubordination and her helpfulness as overstepping boundaries, he was ensuring that other personnel would view her expertise with suspicion rather than respect. The campaign extended beyond public humiliation into administrative harassment that consumed increasing amounts of Elena's time and energy. Grimmer instituted new documentation requirements that forced Elena to justify every aspect of her work in writing, creating paper trails that suggested she required unusual supervision and oversight. Elena found herself completing reports that detailed not just what she'd done, but why she'd chosen specific approaches, what alternatives she'd considered, and how her decisions aligned with broader facility objectives. The paperwork requirements were nominally applied to all support personnel, but Elena quickly realized that she was the only one actually being held to these impossible standards. Corporal Patricia Hayes, who managed vehicle maintenance, mentioned during a casual conversation that she'd never been asked to complete the detailed analytical reports that Elena was producing daily. "Grimmer told me to just keep the usual maintenance logs," Hayes said with obvious confusion. "What kind of reports is he making you write?" Elena showed Hayes a sample of her required documentation, a 12-page analysis explaining her decision to recommend replacement of rifle slings that showed signs of fabric degradation. Hayes stared at the document with amazement. "Elena, this is like graduate-level technical writing. Why would they need this much detail about routine maintenance issues?" Elena was beginning to understand exactly why. Grimmer was creating an administrative burden so overwhelming that she couldn't possibly maintain her current performance levels, while also completing her expanded documentation requirements. Eventually, she would either request transfer to escape the workload, make mistakes due to exhaustion, or be formally disciplined for failing to meet administrative standards. The strategy was brilliant in its subtlety. Grimmer wasn't directly attacking Elena's competence or questioning her right to serve in her assigned role. Instead, he was using her own expertise against her, suggesting that someone with her technical knowledge should be capable of meeting enhanced standards that would be unreasonable for typical support personnel. Elena's breaking point came during a weapons inspection briefing where Grimmer questioned her assessment of a rifle that had been damaged during a training exercise. The weapon had suffered a hairline crack in the stock that Elena had recommended for immediate replacement, following standard safety protocols. "Vasquez believes this rifle is unsafe for training purposes," Grimmer announced to his assembled students. "But examination by qualified armorer personnel indicates that the crack is superficial and doesn't compromise structural integrity. Can anyone explain why supply personnel might lack the expertise to make accurate assessments of weapon condition?" Elena felt heat rising in her cheeks as students offered explanations about the difference between mechanical knowledge and combat experience, the importance of understanding weapons under stress conditions, and the dangers of overcautious maintenance recommendations that could limit training capabilities. Private Rodriguez, whom Elena had helped just weeks earlier, avoided making eye contact during the session. Elena realized that Grimmer had effectively neutralized any support she might have received from personnel who'd witnessed her competence firsthand. After the briefing, Elena approached Grimmer privately, hoping to address the situation before it escalated further. "Sergeant, I'd like to discuss my duty assignments and documentation requirements." Grimmer looked up from his paperwork with an expression of mild curiosity. "Is there a problem with your current responsibilities, Vasquez?" Elena chose her words carefully. "Sergeant, I'm concerned that my administrative workload may be preventing me from focusing effectively on core supply duties." Grimmer nodded thoughtfully. "I understand your concern. Excellence in military service often requires adapting to increased responsibilities as you demonstrate competence. However, if you feel that current expectations exceed your capabilities, I can certainly recommend reassignment to duties more suited to your skill level." Elena recognized the ultimatum hidden within Grimmer's diplomatic language. She could either accept the increasingly impossible workload without complaint or request transfer that would effectively end her access to the advanced marksmanship program and any opportunity to prove her shooting abilities. "I appreciate your consideration, Sergeant," Elena replied. "I believe I can adapt to current requirements." Grimmer smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose strategic planning had achieved the desired psychological effect. "Excellent. I look forward to seeing continued improvement in your performance standards." As Elena left Grimmer's office, she understood that the systematic campaign against her was just beginning. Grimmer had identified her as a potential threat to his program's traditional structure, and he was methodically eliminating that threat through administrative pressure that would force her to either quit or make mistakes that would justify formal disciplinary action. But Elena also realized something that Grimmer hadn't anticipated. His efforts to suppress her competence were actually providing her with detailed insight into his psychological tactics and strategic methods. Every interaction was teaching her how he thought, how he planned, and most importantly, how he might be vulnerable to approaches he hadn't considered. The question was whether she could survive his suppression campaign long enough to find an opportunity to demonstrate that his assumptions about her capabilities were not just wrong, but catastrophically mistaken. The transformation of Fort Thunderbolt's social landscape happened gradually, then all at once, like water freezing into ice that trapped Elena in a prison of her own making. It started with subtle changes in routine, interactions that Elena initially dismissed as coincidental. Corporal Hayes, who had previously shared coffee breaks and casual conversation about maintenance procedures, began finding excuses to cut their discussions short. "Sorry, Elena, I've got to get back to the motor pool," became her standard exit line, delivered with apologetic smiles that didn't quite reach her eyes. Private Rodriguez, whom Elena had helped avoid potential disaster with the gas ring installation, now avoided the supply building entirely during his off-duty hours. When their paths crossed during official business, he maintained strictly professional demeanor, addressing her as ma'am with military formality that created distance where friendship had once been developing. Elena realized that word of her expanded documentation requirements and Grimmer's public criticisms had spread throughout the facility with the efficiency that only military gossip could achieve. Personnel were drawing logical conclusions about her performance and competence based on the visible evidence of increased supervision and systematic correction. The isolation crystallized during what should have been a routine weekly briefing for all support staff. Colonel Steele had gathered the facility's non-combat personnel to discuss upcoming inspection visits from Pentagon officials, emphasizing the importance of maintaining exemplary standards that would reflect positively on Fort Thunderbolt's reputation. Elena arrived at the briefing room 5 minutes early, as military protocol demanded, only to discover that the informal seating arrangements told a story about her changing status. Previously, She would have joined Hayes and the other support personnel in their usual cluster of seats near the front of the room. But those seats were now occupied, and the remaining empty chairs were positioned in isolation at the back. As other personnel filed into the room, Elena noticed the careful way they avoided making eye contact, the subtle adjustments they made to their seating choices to maintain distance from her position. The message was unmistakable. Whatever problems Elena was having with Sergeant Grimmer were creating complications that others preferred to avoid. Colonel Steele's briefing covered routine administrative topics, but Elena found herself struggling to concentrate on logistic schedules and supply chain protocols. Instead, she was acutely aware of the social dynamics playing out around her, the way conversations stopped when she approached, the careful neutrality in voices that had previously carried warmth and camaraderie. The most devastating moment came when Colonel Steele announced rotational assignments for the upcoming inspection period. Vasquez will be handling specialized documentation duties under Sergeant Grimmer's direct supervision, he announced without elaboration, but Elena could feel the shift in room atmosphere as other personnel absorbed the implications. Being assigned to specialized documentation duties was military euphemism for administrative punishment detail. Everyone in the room understood that Elena was being isolated from normal support operations and placed under enhanced supervision that suggested disciplinary concerns. The announcement effectively labeled her as a problem employee whose performance required extraordinary oversight. After the briefing, Elena attempted to join the usual post-meeting discussion where support personnel would coordinate schedules and share information about upcoming requirements. But the conversation died as she approached, replaced by awkward silence and meaningful glances exchanged between her former colleagues. "Well," Hayes said with forced cheerfulness, "I should get back to the motor pool. Busy day ahead." Others quickly echoed similar sentiments, dispersing with unusual speed that left Elena standing alone in the emptying briefing room. Elena understood that her colleagues weren't being deliberately cruel. Military culture emphasized team cohesion and collective success, which created natural pressure to distance themselves from personnel who appeared to be struggling with performance issues. Associating with someone under administrative scrutiny could raise questions about their own judgment and professional reliability, but understanding the logic didn't diminish the emotional impact of watching relationships that had taken months to develop evaporate within weeks. Elena found herself eating meals in isolation, conducting her duties without the casual interactions that had previously made supply work tolerable, and spending off-duty hours alone in her quarters rather than participating in the social activities that bound Fort Thunderbolt's community together. The professional isolation was reinforced by a series of administrative changes that effectively removed Elena from collaborative projects and integrated operations. Her access to the main supply database was restricted to read-only privileges that prevented her from updating inventory records or coordinating with other departments. Equipment requests that had previously been processed through her position were redirected to alternative personnel, reducing her daily responsibilities to the repetitive documentation tasks that Grimmer had assigned. Elena discovered the full extent of her isolation when she attempted to coordinate with the communications department about radio maintenance schedules. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, whom she'd worked with successfully on multiple projects, seemed genuinely uncomfortable when she approached his office. "Elena," Torres said carefully, "I think there might be some confusion about responsibilities. Sergeant Grimmer sent word that all communications equipment coordination should go through Corporal Hayes now. Something about streamlining administrative procedures." Elena felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. "Mike, I've been handling comms equipment for 8 months. Is there a problem with my work?" Torres avoided direct eye contact, focusing instead on paperwork scattered across his desk. "It's not about your work, Elena. It's just organizational efficiency. You know how these administrative changes work. But Elena could see the truth in Torres's uncomfortable body language and evasive responses. Word had spread that she was having performance issues with Sergeant Grimmer, and other departments were proactively protecting themselves by avoiding collaboration that might create complications if her situation deteriorated further. The social isolation extended beyond work relationships into the personal connections that made military life bearable. Elena had developed friendships with several civilian contractors who worked on the base, relationships that had provided relief from the intensity of military hierarchy and protocol. But even those connections began to deteriorate as word spread about her administrative difficulties. Jennifer Walsh, a logistics coordinator for the civilian catering company, had previously joined Elena for weekly poker games with other off-duty personnel. But when Elena attempted to join the usual Thursday evening game, she found the group had relocated without informing her of the new venue. "Oh, Elena," Walsh said when confronted about the change, "we moved to the recreation center because of scheduling conflicts. I thought someone had mentioned it to you." Elena knew that no one had mentioned the change, and she could see the discomfort in Walsh's expression that suggested the relocation had been specifically designed to exclude her without direct confrontation. Even civilian personnel were distancing themselves from someone who appeared to be having difficulties with military supervision. The psychological impact of comprehensive isolation was more devastating than Elena had anticipated. Military service created artificial families bound together by shared challenges and mutual dependence, and being cut off from those connections left her feeling adrift in ways that civilian employment had never prepared her for. Elena found herself questioning whether her commitment to proving her marksmanship abilities was worth the personal cost of systematic alienation from everyone she'd come to regard as friends and colleagues. The loneliness was compounded by the constant stress of meeting Grimmer's impossible documentation standards while maintaining perfect performance in her remaining duties. Late at night in her quarters, Elena would reread her father's letter and study her grandfather's training manual, searching for strength to continue pursuing a goal that seemed increasingly unrealistic. The techniques and principles that had once filled her with confidence now felt like abstract concepts disconnected from the brutal reality of military politics and social dynamics. But it was during one of these midnight study sessions that Elena discovered something in her grandfather's manual that changed her perspective entirely. Buried in a section about psychological warfare and maintaining focus under extreme pressure was a handwritten note that seemed to speak directly to her current situation. "The enemy's greatest weapon is making you believe you're fighting alone. But isolation is also opportunity. It removes distractions and forces you to rely on the only person who truly matters in the moment of truth, yourself. When they strip away everything else, what remains is who you really are." Elena realized that Grimmer's isolation campaign, while painful, was also preparing her for something she hadn't anticipated. When her moment of truth finally arrived, she wouldn't be depending on social support, institutional backing, or political allies. She would be relying entirely on her own capabilities, her grandfather's legacy, and the skills that no amount of administrative pressure could diminish. The question was whether she would survive the isolation long enough to reach that moment, and whether she would still have the courage to seize it when it came. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning that would forever divide Elena's military career into before and after. Though she wouldn't recognize its significance until the moment Colonel Steele's silver coin was spinning through the desert air above Fort Thunderbolt's most prestigious shooting range. Elena was conducting her morning inventory in the isolated supply building when the facility's intercom crackled to life with an unusual urgency that immediately caught her attention. Colonel Steele's voice, normally reserved for routine administrative announcements, carried an edge of excitement that suggested something extraordinary was about to unfold. All personnel report to Range Alpha for mandatory assembly at 0900 hours, the colonel announced. Attendance is required for all military and civilian staff currently assigned to Fort Thunderbolt. This includes support personnel, instructional staff, and advanced training candidates. Alina checked her watch. 0830 hours, which gave her 30 minutes to secure her inventory and report to the main shooting range. The mandatory nature of the assembly was unusual. Most facility meetings were limited to specific departments or operational personnel. Requiring every person on base to attend suggested either a major policy announcement or a significant event that warranted comprehensive witness. Alina arrived at Range Alpha to find the facility's entire population gathered in a horseshoe formation around the primary shooting line. Nearly 200 personnel stood in formation according to military rank and departmental affiliation, creating a natural amphitheater focused on the shooting positions where Colonel Steele and Sergeant Grimmer waited alongside 3 men in civilian suits whom Alina didn't recognize as support personnel. Alina found herself positioned at the rear of the formation, but the elevated terrain of Range Alpha provided clear sight lines to the shooting positions where the day's events would unfold. She could see Grimmer's students arranged in the front ranks, their excitement visible in animated conversations and frequent glances toward the unidentified civilians. Colonel Steele called the assembly to attention with military precision, his voice carrying clearly across the range in the crisp morning air. Personnel of Fort Thunderbolt, today marks a significant milestone in the history of our advanced marksmanship program. We are honored to host representatives from the Department of Defense's Special Operations Command, who are evaluating our training methodologies for potential adoption across all military sniper programs. Alina felt her pulse quicken as she absorbed the implications. Pentagon officials were conducting formal evaluation of Grimmer's training methods, which meant that Fort Thunderbolt's approach to marksmanship instruction could become the standard for military precision shooting throughout the armed forces. The political and professional stakes couldn't have been higher for both Colonel Steele and Sergeant Grimmer. The evaluation will consist of practical demonstrations of advanced shooting techniques under conditions that simulate real-world operational challenges. Colonel Steele continued, "Our instructional staff will demonstrate capabilities that represent the finest traditions of American military marksmanship." One of the civilian officials stepped forward, consulting notes from a leather portfolio that suggested extensive preparation for this evaluation. Alina could see that he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to high-level military briefings and strategic decision-making. "Colonel Steele, we've reviewed the documentation your facility has provided regarding training outcomes and student performance metrics," the official said, his voice projected to reach the assembled personnel. "Those statistics are impressive, but the Department of Defense is particularly interested in observing practical applications of your methodologies under pressure conditions," Alina noticed. Grimmer's posture straightened with obvious pride as the official continued his remarks. This evaluation represented validation of everything Grimmer had built at Fort Thunderbolt, confirmation that his traditional training methods produced results that exceeded conventional military standards. "We understand that your program emphasizes precision shooting under controlled conditions," the official continued, "but modern combat operations require adaptability and performance under circumstances that can't be replicated in standard training environments. We'd like to observe demonstrations that showcase flexibility and improvisational capability." Alina saw Grimmer exchange a brief glance with Colonel Steele, and she recognized the micro-expression of concern that crossed the sergeant's features. His training program was indeed exceptional at producing precision shooting under optimal conditions, but Alina had observed that his students sometimes struggled when circumstances deviated from established protocols. Colonel Steele addressed the challenge with characteristic military confidence. Sergeant Grimmer has prepared demonstrations that will showcase both our standard training methodologies and advanced techniques for challenging scenarios. We're confident that you'll observe capabilities that exceed any program currently operating in the United States military. The lead Pentagon official nodded approvingly, then reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a silver coin that caught the morning sunlight with brilliant reflection. Elena could see from her position that it was a commemorative coin bearing military insignia, the kind of ceremonial piece that senior officers carried to mark significant career achievements. "Colonel, we've brought a traditional test that has been used to evaluate marksmanship programs for over 50 years, the official announced, holding the coin high enough for the entire assembly to observe. The coin shot represents the ultimate demonstration of precision and timing, hitting a small, moving target under public observation with no opportunity for practice or adjustment. Elena felt her breath catch as she realized what was being proposed. The coin shot was legendary among precision marksmen, a test that required hitting a silver dollar-sized target flipped into the air at unknown timing from unknown distance. It combined every aspect of advanced marksmanship: rapid target acquisition, precise timing, environmental compensation, and absolute accuracy under maximum pressure. "The shooter has one opportunity," the official continued, "to hit the coin while it's airborne. No practice shots, no range estimation, no preparation time. Just pure marksmanship skill demonstrated under conditions that replicate combat decision-making." Grimmer stepped forward with confidence that Elena recognized as carefully controlled performance. "Sir, I'd be honored to demonstrate our program's capabilities using your traditional test. Our training methods prepare students for exactly this type of challenge." The official smiled and gestured toward the shooting line. "Excellent. We'll observe your demonstration, then discuss how your methodologies might be adapted for implementation across other training facilities." Elena watched as Grimmer selected his personal rifle from the weapons rack, the same custom-built precision instrument that had earned him legendary status among military marksmen. The weapon represented thousands of hours of practice, perfect mechanical adjustment, and intimate familiarity that came from years of professional shooting. But as Grimmer prepared for his demonstration, Elena noticed something that sent cold realization flooding through her consciousness. The morning wind conditions were shifting rapidly, creating variable crosscurrents that would make trajectory calculation extremely difficult. The coin would be thrown from an unknown angle at unknown velocity, requiring instantaneous compensation for factors that Grimmer's methodical training approach had never adequately addressed. Elena realized that she was about to witness either Grimmer's greatest triumph or his most public failure, observed by Pentagon officials whose evaluation would determine the future of military marksmanship training. The stakes couldn't have been higher, the pressure couldn't have been more intense, and the test couldn't have been more perfectly designed to expose the limitations of rigid training methodologies. As Elena watched Grimmer assume his shooting position, she understood with crystal clarity that the events unfolding on range Alpha would create opportunities that no amount of planning could have anticipated. The question was whether she would be prepared to seize those opportunities when they presented themselves, because sometimes the most important moments in history arrive disguised as routine demonstrations, and sometimes the difference between triumph and disaster comes down to who steps forward when conventional expertise isn't sufficient to meet extraordinary challenges. The coin shot would reveal more than marksmanship ability. It would demonstrate whether Fort Thunderbolt's training methods could adapt to circumstances that demanded innovation rather than repetition, creativity rather than compliance, and individual brilliance rather than institutional orthodoxy. Elena realized that everything she had endured over the past months, the isolation, the administrative harassment, the systematic undermining of her confidence, had been preparing her for this exact moment when Fort Thunderbolt would need capabilities that existed outside Grimmer's traditional training paradigm. The ultimate test was about to begin, and Elena was the only person on the entire base who possessed the skills necessary to meet it successfully. The sound of Grimmer's rifle discharging echoed across Range Alpha like a thunderclap, followed by a silence so profound that Elena could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears as 200 pairs of eyes tracked the trajectory of Colonel Steele's silver coin spinning through the morning air. The coin completed its arc and struck the hard-packed earth 30 feet beyond the shooting line, intact and unscathed, glinting mockingly in the Arizona sunshine as it rolled to a stop near the target markers. Grimmer had missed completely. Elena watched Sergeant Grimmer's face transformed through a progression of emotions that told the story of a professional reputation crumbling in real time. Initial confidence gave way to confusion, then dawning horror, and finally the controlled panic of someone whose entire career had just been called into question in front of the most important audience of his life. The Pentagon officials exchanged meaningful glances that spoke volumes about their evaluation of Fort Thunderbolt's training program. Elena could see the lead official making notes in his leather portfolio, his expression carefully neutral, but his body language suggesting deep disappointment with what he'd just witnessed. Technical malfunction, perhaps, Colonel Steele suggested, with desperate optimism, stepping forward to examine Grimmer's rifle. Equipment failure can occur under any circumstances. But Grimmer was already shaking his head, his professional integrity forcing him to acknowledge the truth even as it destroyed his reputation. No, sir, the weapon functioned perfectly. The miss was operator error. Elena felt a strange mixture of sympathy and anticipation as she watched Grimmer's world collapse. She understood better than anyone the devastating impact of public failure after months of systematic confidence building. But she also recognized that his failure was creating the exact opportunity she'd been waiting for since her arrival at Fort Thunderbolt. The lead Pentagon official consulted his watch with obvious impatience. Colonel Steele, we have a tight schedule to maintain. Are there other instructional personnel who might demonstrate alternative approaches to this test? Elena saw Colonel Steele's face flush with embarrassment as he realized that Fort Thunderbolt's entire reputation was balanced on the edge of comprehensive failure. The facility's only certified marksmanship instructor had just demonstrated spectacular incompetence in front of evaluators, whose report would determine whether his program received military-wide adoption or complete defunding. Sir, Colonel, Steele said carefully, Sergeant Grimmer represents our most experienced instructor. Perhaps we could schedule a follow-up demonstration under different conditions. The Pentagon official's expression suggested that second chances weren't part of his evaluation protocol. Colonel, we're conducting real-time assessment of your program's capabilities. Combat operations don't provide opportunities for do-overs when initial attempts fail. Elena realized that she was witnessing the precise moment when everything she'd worked toward would either become possible or disappear forever. Fort Thunderbolt's credibility was evaporating by the second. Colonel Steele was facing career-ending humiliation, and the Pentagon officials were preparing to conclude that the facility's training methods were inadequate for military adoption. In 30 seconds, they would pack their equipment and leave, taking with them any possibility that Elena would ever get another chance to demonstrate her capabilities. The isolation, the administrative harassment, the months of systematic undermining, it would all have been meaningless suffering that led nowhere. Elena made the decision that would define the rest of her life. She stepped forward from her position at the rear of the formation, her movement creating ripples of surprise through the assembled personnel, who turned to track her progress toward the shooting line. Elena could hear whispered conversations erupting around her as soldiers and civilian contractors tried to understand why support personnel was approaching the demonstration area. Sir, Elena called out as she approached Colonel Steele, her voice carrying clearly across the range despite the tremor of adrenaline that threatened to undermine her composure. Request permission to attempt the coin shot demonstration. Colonel Steele stared at her with an expression of complete bewilderment, as if Elena had just spoken in a foreign language. Behind him, Elena could see Sergeant Grimmer's face cycling through shock, confusion, and building rage as he processed what was happening. "Vasquez," Colonel Steele said slowly, "your supply personnel. This demonstration requires advanced marksmanship training." Elena felt the weight of 200 people staring at her, their attention heavy with skepticism and disbelief. She could see in their faces the same dismissive assumptions that had defined her entire experience at Fort Thunderbolt, the automatic conviction that someone in her position couldn't possibly possess relevant capabilities. "Sir, I have extensive civilian marksmanship experience," Elena replied, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. "I believe I can successfully complete the coin shot demonstration." The lead Pentagon official stepped closer, studying Elena with the calculating attention of someone trying to assess an unexpected variable. "Miss, this isn't a recreational shooting competition. The coin shot requires precision and timing that takes years of professional training to develop." Elena met his gaze directly, drawing strength from her grandfather's legacy and her father's unwavering belief in her abilities. "Sir, I understand the requirements. I'm confident I can deliver the demonstration you need to observe." "Sergeant." Grimmer finally found his voice, and it carried all the accumulated frustration and humiliation of his public failure. "Vasquez, you're completely out of line. Return to your position immediately before you embarrass yourself and this entire facility." Elena turned to face Grimmer, and for the first time since arriving at Fort Thunderbolt, she allowed him to see the full force of her determination. "Sergeant, with respect, your approach has already been tested. Perhaps it's time to try something different." The assembled personnel erupted in barely controlled chaos as Elena's statement registered across the formation. She had just publicly challenged the most respected marksmanship instructor in the Southwest, suggesting that her untested abilities might succeed where his proven expertise had failed. Colonel Steele raised his hand for silence, his expression suggesting that he was calculating political risks and potential benefits with desperate speed. Elena could see him weighing the certainty of continued failure against the unknown possibility that his supply clerk might somehow salvage the situation. "Vasquez," Colonel Steele said finally, "you understand that failure would reflect poorly, not just on yourself, but on this entire facility's judgment and training standards?" Elena nodded without hesitation. "Yes, sir, I understand completely." The Pentagon official retrieved his silver coin from where it had fallen, studying Elena with obvious curiosity about what would happen next. "Miss, I have to ask, what, exactly, is your civilian shooting background? This is a test that challenges even experienced military marksmen." Elena took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would either open the door to vindication or seal her fate as Fort Thunderbolt's most spectacular failure. "Sir, I was trained using techniques developed by Staff Sergeant Miguel Vasquez, 101st Airborne, Vietnam War. Advanced precision shooting under combat conditions." The Pentagon official's eyebrows rose with obvious recognition. "Miguel Vasquez?" "The designated marksman who developed adaptive shooting protocols for special operations." Elena felt a surge of confidence as she realized that her grandfather's reputation extended into circles she'd never imagined. "Yes, sir. He was my grandfather, and he trained me personally using his original methods." The official exchanged glances with his colleagues, their expressions shifting from skepticism to intense professional interest. Elena could see them recalculating her potential based on information that completely recontextualized her background and capabilities. "Colonel Steele," the lead official said slowly, "I think we'd be very interested in observing a demonstration of Miguel Vasquez's techniques. His innovations influenced military training doctrine for decades." Elena stepped toward the weapons rack, her heart hammering with the knowledge that she had just committed herself to the most important moment of her life. Every person on Fort Thunderbolt was watching. Pentagon officials were taking notes, and her grandfather's legacy hung. In the balance of a single impossible shot, there would be no practice attempts, no preparation time, no opportunity to explain if she failed. In the next 60 seconds, Elena would either vindicate everything she believed about her capabilities, or destroy any chance of ever proving that she belonged among the military's finest marksmen. As she reached for a rifle, Elena heard her grandfather's voice as clearly as if he were standing beside her. "When the moment comes, trust everything I taught you, and remember that excellence belongs to those who are willing to risk everything to achieve it." Elena selected her weapon and turned to face the shooting line, knowing that her life was about to change forever. Around them, the assembled personnel were beginning to absorb the reality that Elena Vasquez, whom they had dismissed as incompetent supply staff, had just demonstrated marksmanship capabilities that exceeded anything they had ever witnessed. At Fort Thunderbolt, Elena realized that everything was about to change, not just for her personally, but for the entire facility's understanding of what constituted excellence in precision shooting. The lead Pentagon official wasn't finished evaluating Elena's capabilities, and what happened next would shatter every assumption about marksmanship, training that had governed Fort Thunderbolt for the past 2 decades. "Miss Vasquez," the official said, reaching into his briefcase and withdrawing 3 additional silver coins. The single coin shot was impressive, but combat operations require sustained performance under increasing pressure. "Would you be willing to attempt a more comprehensive demonstration?" Elena felt her pulse quicken as she realized that her moment of vindication was expanding into something far more significant than a single lucky shot. The Pentagon official was offering her the opportunity to prove that her grandfather's techniques represented a fundamental advancement over traditional training methods. "Sir, I'm prepared for whatever demonstration you consider appropriate," Elena replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what was being proposed. The official smiled with the expression of someone who is about to witness something extraordinary. "Excellent. We'd like to observe 3 consecutive coin shots with decreasing intervals between throws. This will test your ability to maintain accuracy while adapting to rapid target acquisition scenarios." Elena heard Sergeant Grimmer's sharp intake of breath from somewhere behind her, understanding that the sergeant was recognizing the impossibility of what was being proposed. 3 consecutive coin shots would require not just exceptional marksmanship, but the ability to reload, reacquire targets, and maintain perfect accuracy under conditions that would challenge even Olympic-level shooters. Colonel Steele stepped forward with obvious concern. "Sir, that's an extremely demanding test. Even our most experienced instructors would find consecutive coin shots challenging under these conditions." The Pentagon official nodded acknowledgement. "Colonel, we're evaluating training methodologies for adoption across special operations units that face exactly these kinds of challenges. We need to observe capabilities that exceed conventional expectations." Elena understood that she was being offered the chance to demonstrate the full scope of her grandfather's legacy, proving that his innovations could handle requirements that traditional training couldn't meet. But she also recognized that failure at this point would be even more devastating than never attempting the demonstration at all. Elena approached the weapons rack and selected 2 additional rifles, understanding that her grandfather's techniques for rapid weapon transition would be essential for maintaining the timing required for consecutive shots. She positioned the weapons within easy reach, calculating the optimal sequence for loading, aiming, and firing that would minimize time between shots. "Sir," Elena announced, "I'm ready for the consecutive demonstration." The Pentagon official positioned himself with the 3 coins, while his colleagues prepared timing equipment that would document the intervals between successful hits. Elena could see that they were conducting formal evaluation that would become part of official military records about training methodologies and Performance standards. Elena settled into her shooting stance, but this time she modified her position to allow for rapid movement between weapons. Her grandfather's training had included extensive practice with multiple target scenarios that required sustained accuracy under increasing pressure, though she had never attempted anything as challenging as consecutive coin shots. First coin. The official announced, launching the silver disc high into the desert air. Elena tracked the target immediately, her brain calculating trajectory and timing with the automatic precision that years of practice had ingrained into her muscle memory. She fired at the optimal interception point, watching the coin explode into fragments that scattered across the range. Without pausing to observe the results, Elena pivoted to the second rifle, loading a round with mechanical efficiency while her peripheral vision tracked the official's preparation for the next throw. Her grandfather's training emphasized seamless transitions between targets, maintaining mental focus while executing complex physical movements under extreme time pressure. Second coin, the official called, launching the target before Elena had fully completed her weapon transition. Elena swung the rifle toward the spinning coin with fluid motion that demonstrated perfect integration of sight, movement, and timing. Her shot discharged just as the coin reached the optimal interception point, creating another spray of metallic fragments that caught the morning sunlight. Elena immediately dropped the second rifle and reached for the third weapon. Her movements, displaying the kind of practiced efficiency that could only come from thousands of hours of specialized training. The assembled crowd watched in stunned silence as Elena demonstrated capabilities that seemed to transcend normal human limitations. Third coin, the official announced, his voice carrying obvious amazement as he launched the final target. Elena's third shot was even more precise than her previous attempts, striking the coin at dead center and creating the most dramatic explosion of fragments yet. The timing between her 3 consecutive hits was so rapid that many observers hadn't fully processed the second shot before the third target was already destroyed. The silence that followed was profound, as 200 people struggled to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Elena had accomplished something that military marksmanship instructors would have considered theoretically impossible, demonstrating sustained accuracy under conditions that challenged every assumption about human shooting capabilities. The lead Pentagon official approached Elena with an expression of professional awe that reflected his understanding of what her demonstration meant for military training doctrine. "Miss Vasquez, what you've just accomplished exceeds every performance standard we use to evaluate marksmanship programs. Those techniques represent capabilities that could transform how we prepare soldiers for combat operations." Elena set down her rifle, feeling the weight of exhaustion from the intense concentration required for consecutive precision shooting. But she also felt something else, the deep satisfaction of knowing that her grandfather's legacy had been vindicated. In the most public way possible, Colonel Steele hurried forward, his excitement barely contained as he realized that Elena's demonstration had elevated Fort Thunderbolt's reputation beyond anything he could have imagined. "Vasquez, that was absolutely extraordinary. How did you develop the ability to maintain accuracy through rapid weapon transitions?" Elena glanced towards Sergeant Grimmer, who stood motionless with an expression of complete shock as he processed the magnitude of what he had just witnessed. She could see in his face the dawning realization that everything he thought he knew about marksmanship training had just been rendered obsolete by techniques he had never encountered. "Sir," Elena replied to Colonel Steele, "my grandfather's methods emphasized adaptability and rapid response to changing conditions. He believed that true marksmanship required understanding principles rather than just following procedures." The Pentagon official was making extensive notes, clearly recognizing that Elena's demonstration had implications that extended far beyond Fort Thunderbolt's evaluation. "Miss Vasquez, we'd like to arrange comprehensive documentation of your grandfather's techniques. What you've shown us could influence military training protocols for decades." Elena realized that her impossible shots had accomplished something she had never anticipated. They had proven that innovation could triumph over tradition, that understanding principles could exceed rigid procedures, and that excellence belonged to those who were willing to think differently about fundamental challenges. Private Rodriguez approached Elena with obvious reverence, his voice filled with amazement. "Ma'am, how did you learn to shoot like that? Those weren't just lucky shots. That was like watching a machine designed for perfect accuracy." Elena smiled, remembering her grandfather's patient explanations about the science behind exceptional marksmanship. "Rodriguez, it's about understanding that shooting is physics, psychology, and practice integrated into a single system. My grandfather taught me that every variable can be calculated and compensated for if you understand the underlying principles." Around them, the assembled personnel were beginning to approach Elena with expressions of respect and curiosity that contrasted sharply with the dismissive treatment she had endured for months. Elena could see that her demonstration had fundamentally altered how everyone at Fort Thunderbolt perceived her capabilities and potential, but Elena also understood that her triumph was simultaneously creating a crisis for Sergeant Grimmer, whose entire professional identity had been built on being the facility's unquestioned expert in marksmanship training. He had just watched a supply clerk demonstrate capabilities that exceeded his own using methods he didn't understand, effectively undermining everything he had built at Fort Thunderbolt. Elena realized that her moment of vindication was opening possibilities she had never imagined, but it was also creating responsibilities that would require her to help rebuild what her success had necessarily destroyed. Because true leadership wasn't just about proving individual excellence, it was about elevating others to achieve capabilities they hadn't known they possessed. The transformation began immediately, but the formal recognition would come 3 hours later in Colonel Steele's office, where Elena found herself sitting across from the Pentagon officials who were rewriting their evaluation of Fort Thunderbolt based entirely on what they had witnessed during her demonstration. "Miss Vasquez," the lead official said, consulting notes that had grown substantially since the morning's events, "we've been in contact with Washington regarding your grandfather's military records. The classified portions of Staff Sergeant Miguel Vasquez's service file have been declassified specifically for this evaluation, and the information confirms everything you've demonstrated today." Elena felt a surge of validation as she realized that her grandfather's legacy was being officially recognized at the highest levels of military command. The techniques that had seemed like family secrets passed down through weekend training sessions were actually documented innovations that had influenced military doctrine for decades. "Your grandfather's adaptive shooting protocols were used to train special operations personnel for over 20 years. The official continued. "His techniques produced measurable improvements in accuracy and performance under stress that exceeded conventional training methods by significant margins. What we witness today confirms that those innovations have been preserved and refined through your family's instruction." Colonel Steele leaned forward with obvious excitement about the implications for Fort Thunderbolt's future. "Sir, if Elena's techniques represent proven special operations methods, we'd like to discuss integration into our advanced marksmanship program immediately." The Pentagon official smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose evaluation had exceeded all expectations. "Colonel, we're prepared to recommend Fort Thunderbolt for designation as the military's primary research facility for advanced marksmanship techniques, with Miss Vasquez serving as lead instructor for implementation of her grandfather's methods." Elena absorbed the magnitude of what was being proposed, understanding that she was being offered the opportunity to transform Fort Thunderbolt's entire approach to marksmanship training. The position would give her authority to implement her grandfather's techniques across the military's most prestigious shooting program, elevating adaptive methods over traditional procedures. "Sir," Elena replied carefully, "I'm honored by the proposal, But I'd want to ensure that existing personnel receive appropriate recognition for their contributions. This facility has produced exceptional marksmen using established methods. The official nodded approvingly, recognizing Elena's diplomatic approach to a politically sensitive situation. Miss Vasquez, your grandfather's files include notes about leadership philosophy that emphasize collaboration rather than replacement. He believed that the most effective training combined traditional fundamentals with innovative adaptation. Elena realized that her grandfather had anticipated exactly this situation, understanding that revolutionary techniques would eventually need to be integrated with existing military structure rather than simply replacing established methods. His wisdom extended beyond marksmanship into the complex dynamics of institutional change and professional relationships. We'd like to propose a transition period where you work directly with Sergeant Grimmer to develop hybrid training protocols that incorporate both traditional precision techniques and your grandfather's adaptive methods, the official explained. This would preserve the facility's existing strengths while adding capabilities that could revolutionize military marksmanship. Elena glanced toward Colonel Steele, understanding that this proposal would require unprecedented cooperation between herself and the sergeant who had spent months systematically undermining her confidence. But she also recognized that Grimmer's expertise in traditional methods could provide an essential foundation for implementing her grandfather's innovations. Sir, I believe that approach would produce the most effective training program possible. Elena agreed. Sergeant Grimmer's understanding of fundamental techniques would be invaluable for integrating adaptive methods into comprehensive instruction. The meeting continued for another hour, covering implementation timelines, resource requirements, and evaluation protocols that would measure the effectiveness of combined training approaches. Elena found herself participating in strategic planning at levels she had never imagined possible, contributing insights about marksmanship techniques that were shaping military policy decisions. When the formal meeting concluded, Elena walked across Fort Thunderbolt toward the advanced marksmanship facility, knowing that she needed to address the situation with Sergeant Grimmer before their new working relationship could begin. The conversation would be difficult, but Elena understood that genuine collaboration required honest acknowledgement of what had occurred. Elena found Grimmer in his office, staring at the display case containing his service rifle from Somalia. His posture reflected the emotional devastation of someone whose entire professional identity had been called into question by events beyond his understanding or control. "Sergeant," Elena said quietly, "may I come in?" Grimmer looked up with an expression that mixed humiliation, confusion, and reluctant curiosity about what Elena might say. "Vasquez, I suppose congratulations are in order. You've accomplished something I would have considered impossible this morning." Elena entered the office and took a seat across from Grimmer's desk, noting the framed certificates and commendations that documented his genuine expertise and dedicated service. "Sergeant, what happened today doesn't diminish anything you've achieved. Your training methods have produced exceptional marksmen for years." Grimmer studied Elena's face, clearly trying to reconcile her diplomatic words with the memory of watching her demonstrate capabilities that exceeded his own. "Vasquez, I was completely wrong about your abilities. I spent months treating you like incompetent support personnel when you possessed training that I'd never encountered." Elena appreciated his directness, understanding that Grimmer was confronting the reality of his misjudgment with the same professional honesty that had defined his military career. "Sergeant, you couldn't have known about my background. I was deliberately concealing capabilities that I'd been instructed to keep private." Grimmer leaned back in his chair, processing the implications of Elena's statement. "Your grandfather's techniques, they're genuinely superior to conventional military training?" Elena chose her words carefully, recognizing that Grimmer's ego was already damaged and that her response would influence their future working relationship. "Sergeant, my grandfather's methods are different, not necessarily superior. They emphasize adaptability where traditional training emphasizes precision. Both approaches have advantages depending on operational requirements. Grimmer nodded slowly, his expression suggesting that he was beginning to understand how Elena's demonstration fit into broader questions about military training doctrine. The Pentagon officials want us to work together on integration protocols? Elena confirmed the assignment, understanding that Grimmer was struggling with the reality of collaborating with someone he had systematically undermined for months. Sergeant, I believe your expertise in fundamental techniques would be essential for developing effective hybrid training. My grandfather's methods work best when students have mastered traditional precision fundamentals. Grimmer was quiet for several moments, clearly wrestling with professional pride and practical necessity. Finally, he looked directly at Elena with an expression of grudging respect that acknowledged the changed dynamics between them. Vasquez, Grimmer said finally, I owe you an apology. I treated you poorly based on assumptions that were completely incorrect. If we're going to work together effectively, I need to acknowledge that my behavior was unprofessional and unfair. Elena felt a mixture of satisfaction and sympathy as she heard Grimmer's admission, understanding that his apology represented genuine recognition of her capabilities rather than diplomatic necessity. Sergeant, I appreciate your honesty. I think we can build an effective partnership based on mutual respect for what each of us brings to the program. Grimmer extended his hand across the desk, offering a handshake that symbolized their transition from adversaries to potential collaborators. Elena, I'd like to learn everything you can teach me about your grandfather's techniques. What you demonstrated today could help me become a better instructor. Elena shook his hand, feeling the weight of months of conflict being replaced by the possibility of genuine professional partnership. Dale, I think we can create a training program that honors both traditional methods and innovative adaptation. My grandfather would have appreciated working with someone who understands the importance of fundamental precision. As Elena left Grimmer's office, she realized that her vindication had accomplished something more significant than personal recognition. She had proven that excellence could emerge from unexpected sources, that innovation could enhance rather than replace tradition, and that true leadership required lifting others rather than simply demonstrating individual superiority. The reversal was complete, but Elena understood that her real work was just beginning. Transforming Fort Thunderbolt's training program would require not just exceptional marksmanship skills, but the diplomatic and instructional capabilities necessary to integrate revolutionary techniques into established military culture. Elena walked toward her quarters, knowing that tomorrow would bring challenges she had never imagined, but also opportunities to honor her grandfather's legacy by sharing his innovations with a new generation of military marksmen who would carry those techniques into combat operations around the world. 18 months later, Captain Elena Vasquez stood before an assembly of 250 military personnel at the newly renamed Miguel Vasquez Advanced Marksmanship Center. Watching as the first graduating class of the integrated training program prepared to receive their specialized sniper designations from visiting Pentagon officials who had traveled from Washington specifically to witness the ceremony, the transformation of Fort Thunderbolt had exceeded every expectation. Elena's grandfather's adaptive shooting techniques, combined with Grimmer's traditional precision fundamentals, had produced marksmen whose capabilities surpassed anything previously achieved. In American military training, the hybrid program was now being replicated at military facilities across 3 continents, with Elena serving as chief instructor for implementation teams that were revolutionizing marksmanship training worldwide. Elena's eyes moved across the graduating students, noting the diversity that would have been impossible under the previous program structure. 12 women had completed the advanced training alongside 38 men, all demonstrating capabilities that proved gender was irrelevant to Marksmanship excellence when proper techniques were combined with appropriate instruction methods. Private Rodriguez, now Corporal Rodriguez, sat in the front row wearing the distinctive insignia of a designated marksman specialist. His transformation from struggling student to exceptional shooter exemplified what Elena's integrated training approach could accomplish when students received instruction that matched their individual learning characteristics rather than forcing conformity to rigid procedures. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elena announced as the ceremony began, "today we celebrate not just individual achievement, but the vindication of a training philosophy that values adaptation over tradition, understanding over repetition, and excellence over conformity." Elena's promotion to captain had come 8 months earlier, along with assignment as the military's youngest facility commander in the Specialized Training Division. Her authority extended far beyond Fort Thunderbolt to oversight of marksmanship, programs that were implementing her grandfather's techniques across multiple branches of the armed services. But Elena's most significant accomplishment wasn't bureaucratic advancement or institutional recognition. It was the fundamental change in military culture that her success had inspired. Women throughout the armed services were requesting assignment to combat specialties that had previously been closed to them, citing Elena's example as proof that capability mattered more than gender in determining military effectiveness. Master Sergeant Dale Grimmer approached the podium to present Advanced Marksmanship Awards to graduating students, his presence representing the successful integration of traditional expertise with innovative methods. Grimmer had embraced Elena's techniques with the same dedication he'd once applied to conventional training, becoming one of the most effective instructors in the hybrid program. 18 months ago, Grimmer announced to the assembled graduates, "I witnessed marksmanship that challenged everything I thought I understood about precision shooting." Captain Vasquez demonstrated that excellence comes not from following established procedures, but from understanding principles deeply enough to adapt them to any situation. Elena felt deep satisfaction as she listened to Grimmer's remarks, knowing that his conversion from skeptical traditionalist to enthusiastic advocate for adaptive techniques represented proof that even entrenched institutional resistance could be overcome through demonstrated competence and diplomatic leadership. The ceremony continued with presentations of specialized equipment to graduates who would be deploying to combat units around the world, carrying Elena's grandfather's techniques into operational environments where their enhanced capabilities would provide tactical advantages that could save lives and complete missions that conventional training couldn't support. After the formal presentations concluded, Elena was approached by a young woman whose presence at Fort Thunderbolt represented the continuing expansion of opportunities that Elena's success had created. "Captain Vasquez," said Second Lieutenant Maria Santos, a recent graduate from the military academy who had specifically requested assignment to marksmanship training, "I wanted to thank you for proving that women could excel in roles that were previously considered impossible for us." Elena studied Santos's determined expression, recognizing the same burning ambition that had driven her own pursuit of marksmanship excellence despite systematic discouragement. "Lieutenant, what you accomplish in this program will depend on your dedication to understanding principles rather than just following procedures. Are you prepared for training that will challenge everything you think you know about precision shooting?" Santos nodded with enthusiasm that reminded Elena of her own excitement when she'd first discovered her grandfather's training manual. "Ma'am, I've studied your grandfather's techniques and your implementation of his methods. I believe adaptive marksmanship represents the future of military precision shooting." Elena smiled, understanding that Santos represented the next generation of military marksmen, who would build upon the foundation that Elena had established through her unlikely journey from dismissed supply clerk to revolutionary instructor. "Lieutenant, excellence in marksmanship requires more than technical skill. It requires the courage to trust your abilities when conventional wisdom suggests you should fail." Elena's conversation with Santos was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Patricia Reynolds, the Pentagon official who had been instrumental in recognizing the potential of Elena's grandfather's techniques. Reynolds carried a folder that Elena suspected contained her next assignment in the expanding implementation of adaptive marksmanship training. "Captain Vasquez," Colonel Reynolds said, "Washington has approved your proposal for international training exchange programs. We'd like you to establish adaptive marksmanship centers in allied nations, sharing your grandfather's techniques with NATO Special Operations units." Elena accepted the folder containing assignment details that would extend her influence to military organizations across Europe and Asia, spreading her grandfather's innovations to training programs that would prepare international forces for cooperative operations requiring unprecedented precision capabilities. "Colonel," Elena replied, "I'm honored by the assignment. My grandfather believed that excellence in marksmanship belonged to all warriors who were willing to pursue it with proper dedication." Elena realized that her journey had evolved far beyond personal vindication into something approaching historical significance. Her grandfather's techniques were becoming foundational elements of military training doctrine that would influence combat effectiveness for decades, touching thousands of soldiers whose enhanced capabilities would serve their nations in ways that Miguel Vasquez could never have imagined. As the ceremony crowd dispersed, Elena walked alone across the ranges where she had once cleaned rifles, as invisible support personnel, reflecting on the unlikely path that had led from systematic dismissal to international recognition. The journey had required not just exceptional marksmanship skills, but the psychological resilience to maintain confidence. Despite months of isolation and administrative harassment, Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from her father. "Watch the ceremony broadcast. Grandpa would be proud. Your mother wants to know when you're coming home for dinner." Elena smiled as she typed her response, understanding that her grandfather's legacy lived not just in military training programs and Pentagon policy documents, but in the continuing tradition of family members who understood that excellence required both exceptional skill and the courage to prove it. When circumstances demanded impossible achievements, the sun was setting over the Arizona mountains, painting the desert landscape in colors that reminded Elena of her childhood trips to the abandoned quarry where her father had first taught her to shoot. Those weekend sessions had seemed like simple family bonding at the time, but Elena now understood that they had been preparation for challenges that would extend far beyond individual achievement. Elena's story had become inspiration for military personnel around the world who faced their own battles against institutional prejudice and systematic underestimation. Her success proved that hidden capabilities could emerge from the most unlikely sources, that innovation could triumph over tradition when properly applied, and that true leadership required elevating others rather than simply demonstrating personal superiority. As Elena headed toward her quarters to begin planning the international training programs that would extend her grandfather's legacy across multiple continents, she carried with her the knowledge that some stories don't end with individual triumph. They evolve into movements that change entire institutions and inspire generations of people who refuse to accept limitations imposed by others. Narrow vision of what constitutes excellence. The silver coin that had shattered in the Arizona air 18 months earlier had taken with it every assumption about Elena's capabilities, replacing systematic dismissal with recognition that would echo through military marksmanship training for decades to come. And in conference rooms and training facilities around the world, Elena's example was inspiring others to step forward and prove that excellence belongs to those who are willing to risk everything to achieve it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.